I put together some things. When I put them together, they look like that. But you will observe that thanks to the ministrations of my youngest granddaughter, they look much prettier by the time you receive them. One of them is a list of the past mini-cons from beginning to end. The first one, I took my two oldest granddaughters along with me. They were at that time in middle school, so you have some idea of time having passed. The adventures at the mini-cons have been interesting and many. The other one that we have is remembering participants who have been part of the series and aren't with us any longer. Eric, obviously, as the founder and the inspiration and the glory of the whole thing. But others, and I've asked some people to remember for us some of the people, and we'll come to Lucille when the others have spoken about some of the other people who have been with us. There's so much else that has been invested in the series over the years that we, need to thank. If you think about all the work that Mike Watson and Mike Nagel did when they did the search engines and the flags for all of the new provinces in the United States of Europe, I look at this and I think of Pogo, who died fairly early in the series. She only made one contribution. But Pogo was a delightful person. She was an enthusiastic member of the Society for Creative Anachronism. She was deeply into heraldry, and she designed early on the most wonderful heraldic shield for Eric, which used a metal garbage can as the background and a bowler hat where they put the ornamental little crowns on the top, impaled by roadkill, and generally just being something that would have given indigestion to the formal devotees of heraldry one way or the other, and I liked it. Many of the others are probably before the time that many of you became involved in the series. However, others are very lively in living memory. And I've asked David Carrico if he would start us off by talking about Rick Boatley, because really everybody remembers Rick, obviously.
You should have warned me I was going to be first. I'm wiping chocolate fudge off my face. Well, first of all, it's impossible to talk about Rick without talking about Eric. Eric was the creative genius behind everything we celebrate in 1632 and Ring of Fire. And he attracted a cloud of talented people as soon as that initial idea was revealed on the bar. And Rick was one of those very talented people. I'm probably going to choke up doing this. You hear the phrase guys talk about, oh, he's my brother from another mother? That was Rick to me. I'm an only child. I was telling Tony earlier, I am so introverted, I should have been the poster child for introversion.
But you were just shy to apply.
That's truer than you might think. And until I walked into the 1632 crowd, I could number the true friends that I had on the fingers of one hand. I discovered Ring of Fire in 2003. I discovered the Grantville Gazette in 2003. And although I had been trying to be a writer for 20 years, I had yet to produce anything that was marketable. But 1632 caught my attention. My bachelor's degree is in music theory and composition. As soon as I heard of the 1632 idea, I had this mental image, because about that time frame, or a little bit before that time frame, the JBL Speaker Company had an ad of a dude sitting in front of a monster monitor, clutching the arms of this armchair with his tie whipping in the breeze being generated by that speaker. And the vision I had was Johann Sebastian Bach sitting in that chair with that L200 blowing at 110 decibels and his wig flapping in the breeze. That's what got me in to 1632. That drew me in. And those of you who know anything about my writing in 1632 know that the predominant characters that I work with are musicians trying to come to grips with 350 years of Western European and American music being dumped in their lap. And Rick was one of the first people I met. Because in 2004, at Conestoga in Tulsa, Rick was there. Because Eric was there. Eric was guest of honor that year. I found out about that on Tuesday when the con started on Friday. And I ran into my boss's office and said, I ain't going to be here Friday. I'm going to Tulsa to a science fiction convention. And they knew me well enough to say, okay, well, just come back to us on Monday. The first person I met was Eric. I'm walking toward the hotel building. Eric comes out of a side door because he's got to get a smoke. This is back when he was still smoking. He wanted a cigarette real bad. He walked out. I introduced myself. I said, hi, I'm David Carrico. You're considering one of my stories. He said, oh yeah. So I'm going to read it tonight. And we talked for a little while. And he took me in with him, took me to the table where everybody else was sitting. And there was Paula, and there was Rick, and there was Gorg, and somebody else was there. And introduced, sat me down in the middle of everybody, and that's where I met everybody. And that's where Rick and I connected immediately. Rick was a gentleman. Rick was also a gentle man. He was, I'm not small, Rick was to me. And he had an infectious laugh. He never met somebody that was a stranger. He always greeted somebody. First time he met him, hi, how are you? What can you do? What do you know? What can we talk about? And he wasn't my mentor. That was Eric's role. Eric was the mentor. Eric was the guy who gave me a chance when nobody else had taken me. Eric was the guy who was at every step in my professional career. He was there and involved in it in some way. Eric paid it forward better than anybody I know. Rick was right behind him. And Rick became my number one supporter because he loved my character, Marlon. Rick became my number one story doctor, became my number one alpha reader, and would talk to me about anything. It didn't matter what crazy idea I had, what crazy question I had. If I raised it, if he didn't have an answer, the next day he would send me a 5,000-word monograph that he had researched and written up that night. He was Eric's chief technical guru. Eric was hard on computers. Rick had to resurrect some along the way. And when he couldn't resurrect them, he'd get new ones. Eric was not a Luddite, but Eric was basically a-technological. Technology was a mystery to Eric. He just wanted to push a button and have it do what he wanted it to do. And Rick sometimes managed to make that happen. Eric had a lot of ideas. Rick made a lot of those ideas happen. Eric had some ideas that weren't so good. Rick talked him out. Rick supported Eric in every way that he could. And along the way, he supported a lot of us in every way that he could. I'm a better writer because of Rick being in my life. I tell better stories because of Rick being in my life. A lot of us don't know the prices that Rick paid to be that guy. The late nights, the stress on his family, the things that, the blatant way that we just flat took advantage of him. And yet, he was always gracious, he was always kind, and he always loved 1632 with every ounce of his being.
Okay, thank you so much, David. This is very kind of you to do it. I'll always remember Rick's expression. We were standing around the table at a con in a bar when he and I, between us, came up with the idea that Dr. Gribbleblots would love Kirlian photography, and Eric's face went, And moving onward from Rick to one of his best co-conspirators, Walter Hunt has agreed to say a few words about Kevin Evans and the wonderful people of Weird Tech.
Am I the co-conspirator, or am I going to talk about the co-conspirator? I want to touch on Rick for just a moment. Rick taught me everything I needed to know about how crystal radios work on a napkin at Chicago World Fair. He said, "You need to know how this works. Let me draw you a picture," and he did. Because Rick, among other wonderful attributes, was a teacher, and he really was a teacher. So, in order to do some of the wonderful things that we do in 1632, we have to have tech. And I remember Rick always used to say, "But what's the difference between a 1632 dirigible and a steampunk dirigible? What's the one thing that steampunk dirigibles don't have that they really need to have?" And the answer, of course, is wheels, because they're too heavy to get off the ground. So he'd do this tech panel, and I was on it a few times. But in order to have the kind of wonder that we have in 1632, you don't just need the teacher, the scientist, the technological wizard that Rick was. You needed a crazy scientist. You needed a mad scientist, and that was Kevin Evans. I think you'll agree. As Virginia told me, every time, not every time, but on many occasions, Rick would come up with some clever thing, and then Kevin would build one. He'd show up with some kind of new version of a shotgun, or he'd come up, he had steam engine ideas, and he'd show up and he'd build these things, and then they'd come to the convention and he'd show them off. And he had such glee in doing that. I think Karen humored him, but he was very humorable, or humorous. He was, and I think Rick had to rein him in from time to time. But Kevin was truly the most wonderful mad scientist you'd ever meet, because you never knew what he'd come up with next. And he enriched all kinds of stories. And they wrote the New Mexico stories and wrote some other things. And Kevin and Karen were a team. And I always liked talking to Kevin, because I never knew what would come out next. I'm not a-technological, but I'm in no way in the category of either Rick or Kevin. But watching these guys think and work and just listening and saying, "Oh, I can use that." So when I did Cardinal Virtues, one of the things we have in there is telegraphy. There's a communication. And Rick helped me write that section to make sure I got it right. So if you read that, I got it right because of Rick. But I always wanted to incorporate something that Kevin had invented. So that's how I remember Kevin as a mad scientist. And we miss him, because we don't have a reigning mad scientist. We need one. So if anybody knows mad scientists, we need to bring one in. Thank you.
Well, we can't really talk about Kevin without talking about Karen. And we can't really talk about Karen without talking about Karen. There are two of them, Karen Bergstrahl and Karen Evans. Karen Evans, Karen went out shopping and found upholstery fabric that imitated the embroidery design on the wedding suit of Gustavus Adolphus, and bought some of the fabric and made a 16th century costume, which she wore to the cons. Karen realized that chocolate was being introduced into Europe at the time, decided that Kevin and Karen were Mormons, very faithful members of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And Karen thought, "Oh, this talk about coffee, I think I'd rather talk about chocolate. Chocolate's even better." And she brought various kinds of chocolate to our cons. She held chocolate seminars on how one processed it. She gave us samples of how it would have been drunk in colonial Mexico, how it would have been modified when it was imported into Spain. Chocolate here, chocolate there. It was wonderful what she did with that. And she put, you're right, Walter, Kevin was a mad scientist, He wrote the ship that went to Tranquebar. Karen wrote the people who went in the ship. And you're right, they were a total working partnership all the way through. And Karen and I were on some panels together. Karen, the other, Karen Bergstrahl, was interested in everything. But basically, she gave us horses, because Karen really knew horses, working with horses. She had worked with horses a great deal of her life. Archaeology, which was another of her major interests, and clothing. She was an engineer by profession. She worked at Lockheed. Those were just things that she was interested in. And 1632 opened to her the option of sharing her passions with people who were willing to share her passions with her and not look at her and say, "What are you doing?" Because she said she spent most of her life with people. She never married. She was on her own. She said, "I spent the most of my life with people, with men, who would take their families to Disneyland and let their wives and children get in line and stand there and say to one another, 'Well, if we moved that switch an inch and a half to the rear.'" And she had found, let us say Karen found that a bit tedious. She felt that, you know, while it was fine to be an engineer and it was a good and rewarding life for her, there really was more to life than designing exactly where a switch ought to belong. So she did it most splendidly. If anyone else I've been trying to recruit people with memories. If anyone else wants to talk about anyone on our list, I'd love to do it. Yes, come on.
Good.
Yes, you are
I'm Kurt Beatty.
Kurt Beatty, yes.
I've enjoyed, I'm not a writer at all. My degrees are in physics, math, and chemistry, and electrical engineering. I've made a lot of money in venture capital, a big house on the lake outside of Austin. And I first met Eric at the Linicon #2 in Austin. Linicon is for Linux. Eric was the writer guest of honor of Linicon #2. This was like probably 2001, 2002, maybe 2003, something in there. And 1632 and 1633 had come out by that time. And I had read the books and thought they were quite delightful. And I've been to 47 World Cons. My first World Con was in Kansas City in '76. And so I'm sure that I had seen or been near or seen Eric standing up, but I never spoke to him. You know, that's just the way big crowds, you know, you don't. And I was so delighted to find him be the guest of honor, and I just read those books. And I went up to him and I said, "I got one bone to pick with you." At that time, I sold it 2 years ago. I had a 33-foot Ultimate Warlock, which is a tunnel hull catamaran with twin 500 horsepower Mercruiser racing engines in it. And he had an Outlaw 33, which is a far inferior boat to the one I have. Just personal opinion. It's a monohull versus a catamaran, doesn't go nearly as fast. And on our lake out there, we don't have a speed limit, but we have a noise limit. And the noise limit is at idle, your engines can't be over 101 dB, 102 dB or something like that. And every time I was tested, which happened 3 times, because my boat was loud, and they test you, and you had to idle it at the dock, and they measured it with their noise meters, and I always passed by just over 1 dB. The engines were tuned up very nicely, thank you. And I told him that your scene in 1633 with the outlaw speedboat coming at the sailing ship was unbelievably wrong. On a sailing ship out in the ocean at that time, you'd hear the flap of the wind against the fabric of the sails. You'd hear the lines humming. I'm also a sailor besides being a boating enthusiast. You'd hear the waves lapping and moving, and you'd hear the forward motion of the boat, maybe a little sound from where the rudder creaked. All of a sudden, 140, 150 dBs of twin big block engines would come pounding out. It would have been the loudest sound these people had ever heard, except if they'd been at a major explosion like in the Acropolis when the thing blew up, or at some volcanic eruption or something like that. It would have been the loudest sound those people had ever heard. So they wouldn't suddenly have seen a fast-moving object. They would have said, there's a demon out of hell over that way. And then this boat comes. And I offered to take him out for a boat ride if he wanted to experience it himself. He thanked me for my input. I think he was amused that I corrected that for him. I met Rick Boatwright at Conestoga, which was, I was flying around all the time, in and out of Austin and stuff. And so I saw that there was going to be a 1632. He was the guest of honor at Conestoga. So I went up there and I said, I've been subscribing to the magazines and everything else. I think I'll go up and hang out with these, even though I'm just a fanboy, right? I don't count. and I'm the one that told, so I asked Rick if there were going to be any more Gribbleflot stories. And Rick told me, he says, I think there were 3 or 4 at that time. And he says, we've beaten that to death. We're not going to pound on that thing any longer. It's the joke is over with. And I said, oh, no, it's not. It is not. He said, what are you talking about? I said, 2 words. He says, okay. And I said, Carillion photography. Now, you'll say, what is this? Kurt Beatty is the Kurt Beta Tuckerized in that story.
That's great.
I've enjoyed the output of this group. Jorg knows me. He Tuckerized me once as well.
There are other people. Bjorn said he'd be willing to say something about Jose and about Jody Dorset. Jody Dorset, I believe, has the unique distinction of having been the only 1632 writer who met his wife at a minicon, which happened fairly early in the development of the series. So really, 1632 has done things for all sorts of people. So Bjorn, if you can talk about those 2, because I know that Jose's Magdeburg Marines had talk about things that readers wanted more of.
Yes.
They were one.
Yeah. Jody Dorset wrote the 3 R's in Ring of Fire 1.
Oh, back up. There you go.
Jody wrote the 3 R's in the first Ring of Fire, Reading, Writing, and Revolution. And that seemed like a story that was just setting up the next one. But if you've read the Transylvania book, then you recognize that Jody set something off that's still reverberating through the mainline Europe books. And he, after meeting his wife, they continued to go to cons. I met him at Liberty Con in 2015. And we were outside the Overflow Hotel. He'd just written up on his bike and parked it up next to the hotel there. And we got to talking, and he said he'd written a 1632 story, and then proceeded to explain who he was. I was like, oh, you're him. and then said, I've got an idea for another one. And he started to go through this story about one of the Bohemian brethren who became disaffected with the war had some PTSD, went to North America, and he laid this whole thing out there for me. And I said, you got to go ahead and write this stuff. And he said, nah. But he knew the characters, he knew what people were like, and even though he has only the one story, it's very influential, and I want to make sure that we continue to follow that plot line with the Bohemians that he started off. And then with Jose, of course you all know he did the Marines. And there's not just the stories. There's the PowerPoint presentation that he sent us to go with them, going down through their unit organization. And each of the subunit organizations. And it's a really extensive, very modern-looking document that Eric did not let him get away with quite all of that stuff in there. But he was very enthusiastic about getting the Marines, into the bigger picture of the series, and succeeded in doing that. And also making sure that we treated the military characters like human beings. He worked at Walter Reed, and that was very much a part of who he was. And I was telling the first panel of the day that he had written this story. Unfortunately, we never ran it because it's set in the uptime after the Ring of Fire, where people go back trying to get as close as they can to the Forbidden Zone to remember the people who disappeared. And it's something that we can't run, but it gets posted on the bar every Memorial Day. And I kind of wanted to think of that as, them in the story remembering their people, but also us keeping these folks in mind. Been in the series before us.
There's actually one author on here whom none of us ever met, and that was Eva Musch. She was a fan from Germany. She got in touch with me because she had written a story in German that she wanted to submit, and would I be so kind, because her background was fascinating. She was Hungarian. She had come out of Hungary after the 1956 revolution, had gotten her doctorate in sociology in Germany, and been a social worker there for probably almost 40 years. She had been fascinated by the phenomenon of the expansion of American influence in Germany in her own lifetime, and was interested in writing something that might parallel it. She had actually done a year, maybe 2 years, as an exchange faculty member at a college in West Virginia, so that had also caught her eye. She did 2 stories for us, and then she died quite early. I was hoping that we would have other stories, but she just stopped being in touch. And I emailed, and then I emailed again, and eventually I heard from her daughter saying that she had come down with a respiratory infection. They had sent her to Morocco in hopes that it would dry it out, and it hadn't. So she had passed on. But both of her stories were, I thought, interesting, although I will say that both Kevin and Karen, being themselves LDS, thought that she didn't get her LDS characters right. They told me in great detail exactly how they thought she hadn't gotten them right. John Johnson, his stories are a great deal of fun. He looked, he came to a couple of the panels that Karen Bergstrahl did on clothing and decided that what the 17th century would really benefit from was bib overalls. He looked at some of those pictures, the broidels of peasants working in the fields with their pants falling down, and decided, here is a cultural contribution that the Uptime could really make. Other people contributed cargo shorts with all the pockets and things to carry. But, cargo shorts do tend to go down too. My father was a farmer. He never wore anything to work except bib overalls. He weighed, he was 5'4". He weighed maybe 120, fully loaded, but those pockets on those bib overalls were fully loaded with every tool you might possibly need in the course of the day. And I thought those were a wonderful addition to the possibility. I want somebody to talk about John Zeke. Those police procedurals were immense. Anybody volunteer? Gorg, you can talk about John.
I'm not horrible with names. And I'm not sure. This is the murder in, yeah. Okay, he had us draw a lot of maps for him.
Lift the mic.
Okay. Yeah, he sort of invented Magdeburg, not the actual Magdeburg, the expansion of Magdeburg. He, the new city, there was Magdeburg and then the new city that was.
And then there was also
Then there was this outskirt thing that he had.
He also did the Granville Police Department.
Yeah.
The old Granville Police.
The Granville Police Department and the Boxer and.
No, that's David.
Oh, that's David. Yeah.
That's David.
Is this the Boxer?
John Zeke did all those murder mysteries.
Yeah.
Not getting?
Not.
Okay, well.
But I remember the maps and I remember building that.
That's
But,
good. No, what John did, basically, John Zeke, was to figure out the impact that a modern police system would have in the early modern period. It's not that the early modern period didn't have police systems. I mean, today you can go to the archives in Nuremberg and ask for a criminal file from the 1630s and they'll bring it up and it'll still have the weapon, sometimes with blood still adhering to the blade. They did do their best, but it wasn't modern in the same way. Many of the people on here I never knew, and I think some people did. Katie Wentworth was a professional. Yes.
So Katie Wentworth was, Katie Wentworth, she actually lived just a little north of here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She was wrote several series. She was a Writers of the Future winner, and she was very active in the contest. She wrote Here Comes Santa Claus, which was the story where they hid Wallenstein as Santa. Yeah, sorry.
The casket of gunpowder hidden
Yes,
in the...
yes, and so that was, I think, the only story she contributed, but it led to Brad's story, which led to the Dennis and Betsy stories. So she's spiritually, she's a little bit of a grandmother to us. But I used to attend her seminars in Tulsa when I was trying to learn how to write, and she used to complain about how people would submit stories with cliches, and her least favorite was the word orbs to describe eyes. And she said, if I see another story where somebody said they looked out through their orbs, she was going to stab somebody.
In the order.
She had a very unique sense of humor.
Okay, there's a memorial to Eric himself tomorrow, and we'll be talking a great deal about Eric. What I want now is to go around this room, and any of you who have written in this series, who are here in the room, I want you to come up and say what Eric did to bring you into the series and how he, like he did for David, mentored you on. And I'm just going to start table by table. Is there anyone here? Walter.
All right, I get to talk.
And just point to the next table when you're done, so I don't have to pop up.
Oh, yeah. I have a continuing career because of Eric. I've written 4 novels for Tor, and they decided they didn't want any more. So I did another novel, which was a solo, which got cut off. And then in 2010, I went to NASFIC in North Carolina, and my wife and daughter didn't want to go. So I drove all the way down from Massachusetts to North Carolina, and by the time I got there, I was saying to myself, why am I here? Why did I come all the way here? First event was autograph session with Eric. And we sat down, and he had a line, and I had, 2 guys. And between times I said, I'm really interested in 1632. Oh, he says, let's have lunch. We go to the bar, we have lunch. And by the time lunch was over, he called Tony, and I had a book contract. Absolutely, that's how it happened. And then there was another friend who was there. I took him to, we went out to dinner, and I said, I'm buying, I got a book contract. He said, how'd you do that? I said, to tell you the truth, I have no idea. But Eric, took me under his wing and said, you should be writing for us. Here's a thing, go do it. And the rest is alternate history. Anybody else there? All right, let's go to here. Let's go to Gort's table.
Gort? Okay, well, first it was Virginia who told me to take my Okay, first it was Virginia who told me to take my 1,000-word rant about how teenagers could build sewing machines in the 17th century and expand it. And then it was Eric who bought it. And took me under his wing and taught me about the business of writing, taught me about a lot of the creative process and the mechanics of it. Hooked me up with Paula. I think it was Eric who arranged that thing. But Eric was really good at getting people to do what they were good at. People can miss that in the vicissitudes of life, and Eric was really good with people like me and other people to get them back into what they should be doing, because what they've got a talent for, what they've got the ability for, and how to bring that ability out. And he did that with me, and I'm dyslexic. I am dyslexic enough where I was actually diagnosed and got books for the blind and visually handicapped for some years. So I am sort of the lowest level where you're actually legally handicapped, but I'm dyslexic enough that I am actually legally handicapped. And when the Sewing Circle manuscript got sent in, Eric sent me a really nasty email saying, if you don't care about this stuff, if you don't, that you're not willing to put in the effort. And I wrote him back and said, well, I did put in the effort, but I'm dyslexic. I'm not going to be able to fix that because I can't. It doesn't work. And he said, oh, well, if there's a real problem, we'll get around it. And that was the beginning of my career. That was my career. I wouldn't have it without it. About Kevin, he built my gun. He built the AK-3 and actually the AK-4. His own version of it. And then Jose, I have a brother who was a combat medic, a naval medic in Vietnam with Marines. I have another brother who was a naval medic in Vietnam. And then there's Jose. And it was those three people who were the basis of Doc, in the short story Doc. So Jose is in my fiction. Jose was also a friend and the guy I called when I got lost and needed somebody to come pick me up. So he was.
So I'm Kevin Eikenberry. I'm here at FenCon teaching the writing workshop, and my career wouldn't have gotten started without meeting Eric Flint in 2014. I was at the Superstars Writing Seminar, and we had a dinner kind of like this, and I had the opportunity to sit and talk with Eric, but that wasn't what changed my life. The first class we had at Superstars that year was Kevin J. Anderson talking about one of his normal speeches on popcorn theory, and then Eric got up to teach a class on contracts. And it was a room about this size, there were about 60 of us, and Eric went through one of his Bain contracts clause by clause and explained what they were. And then at the end of the class, he gave this promise. He said, if you get a contract that you don't like, send it to me, I'll review it for you. And so, long story short, I got sick shortly after that Superstars and nearly died, but I got a contract on my first novel about 6 months later. And I went through it and thought, this doesn't look right. So I'm a young author with no publications to my name, so I type up a very nice professional email. Hi, Mr. Flint, this is Kevin, we met at Superstars, so forth and so on. And were you really serious about looking over this contract? This is my first introduction to how brusque Eric could be in email, because he writes back, send me the goddamn contract.
You can hear his voice. When you
I have permission from Eric to continue to imitate him. So I send him the email, and Eric writes back essentially like 8 pages of why I shouldn't sign that contract. It was a master's level discussion. And so I turned down that literary contract, which was really hard to do as a new writer, to say no. And then a few months later, I got the next offer, and it looked really good to me. And at that point, I had Eric's phone number, and you all were about to go on a cruise. And so I call him, say, hey, I've got another contract. I'm getting on a cruise. Call Kevin. So I called Kevin J. Anderson, had him look over the contract, and he wrote me back by text, hey, congratulations, you're going to be published author. So Eric really was, at that point, you know, I was learning from him without realizing. But then in 2014, that same year, we had that dinner, and most of you have heard the story about how the crossing came about and the question that I asked Eric. And like Walter, I was hit with, let's go to lunch tomorrow. And here I am as this young author with just 2 manuscripts under my belt and this wild, crazy idea that I thought was alternate history that I had no idea how to write. And I had to go to lunch the next day with Eric Flint. And I remember sitting at lunch and going through what my idea was with Eric, and he was patient and he asked questions. And over the course of the next couple of years, because of my sickness and what Eric went through with his first couple of bouts of cancer, we didn't really come back together. And it was a really critical, seminal moment for me when he looked across the table at me at Superstars in 2016 and said, I think it's about time you give me a manuscript. And so I did, and that's how the crossing was born. So I owe an awful lot to Eric, and I won't be at the memorial tomorrow because of my schedule, but Lucille, you all know how much he meant to me, and what I said at DragonCon still stands. Thank you.
I'm not going to give we're not at my table yet, so I'm not going to give my why I got involved, but I think it's important to note that Kevin is now part of staff at Superstars of Writing. So that's yet another thing Eric has done. Sarah, I think you were missed at your table. Did you speak? Stand up? I'm gonna put you on the spot there.
So, the first time the mini-con was at FenCon, I came because I wanted to see the folks who had written the 1632 universe, and one of those folks was Eric Flint, but another one was David Weber. And in passing in the hallway, I got the chance to tell David that I wanted to say thank you for the books, and then a few minutes later, in passing, going to a session Eric was leading, I got the chance to thank him for 2 of the characters he had written in the Honor Harrington universe, and he looked at me and he said, how did you know what those characters meant? And I said, well, they just stand out. And so he said, well, have you written anything? And I said, no, sir, but I copy edited something for 1632 and it got bought. And I got half the money because the author was that generous. And he said, well, you need to write me something. And so I did, and he bought it, and then he bought some more pieces. And so I am now a published writer because of Eric Flint. So that's...
And because you write a good story.
I know there are others.
In 2014, Paula posted, we're looking for help with some things. And like a dummy, I said, okay, what do you need help with? And she's like, well, really, I'm looking for an assistant editor. And I went, huh, what's that? And she said, you're coming to Minicon this year, right? And I'm like, I guess I am now. So I walk in the hotel in Columbus. I've been on the premises for maybe 5 minutes. I go around a corner. Eric's coming the other way. He looks at me, he says, you're Hassler, right? We need to talk. 10 minutes later, we're in the food court, and he's explaining to me what he wants me to do as assistant editor. So that's how that happened. And you know, one day, a few years later, he calls me up out of the blue and he said, hi, it's Eric Flint. I'm like, oh. And he says, you know that North American anthology? Would you be interested in working with me on that? And I'm standing outside a shopping center on the, you know, just got out of my car. I'm on that little grassy strip at the, you know, the end of the road. And I'm just talking to him about stuff in North America, and he's filling me in with the background of this is what we can do, this is what we can't do. And I'm like, okay, okay. And he's like, okay, now I need you to go do that.
Sue? Me. You and Sue, you're at that table. Where do you go? Huh? Go.
All right, if you didn't already know, I'm one of the guys behind the new magazine, and Eric didn't sort of drag me in, except, well, in a way he did, because I was submitting sci-fi and fantasy short stories all over, and if anybody's done much of that outside of the 1632 world, you know what you get is reject, reject, reject. Sometimes you don't hear anything. Mostly you don't hear anything. Eventually I got good enough where I'd get a personalized reject. And somebody told me about, hey, you should look into 1632 if you're willing to put the time in. It can be more likely that you'll get something published. So who is this guy, Eric Flint? he's like allowing all these people to write in his pond. Who does that? And he's even got this short story magazine, and I read some of the article, some of the stories, and this is amazing. He's allowing all these people, and I hear what people are saying about him, and it's like, this is just extraordinary. He's put his own baby out there for everybody to take part in and contribute to and grow, and it was just an amazing thing, and it really was just like I was told. Hey, if you dive in and if you learn a little bit about 1632, you're gonna get your story bought even if you don't have any talent, and I don't think I have a whole lot, but that was such a great experience that with his death and the shutting down of the Grantville Gazette and all that, I was just very determined that, hey, we gotta do something to bring back the short story magazine. And fortunately, I think with Bjorn and Beth Ann, I feel like we made a really good team. It was sort of a unique synthesis that allowed, and the families certainly help and allowing us to do it. Thank you, Lucille. We were able to bring it back, and it's been really great. But all that is because I think Eric Flint was so generous with his talent and his creations to bring us all in. So yeah, I think Eric Flint did bring me in, not the direct way that some of these other folks have been brought in, but yes, just as effectively.
Am I too short for this?
Turn it down.
Turn it down. Just
Rotate the mic.
I don't touch that. I don't know how to do that. Oh, of course, duh. Well, I'll tell you how I got involved in this. My husband, Brad, you'd been writing for him some, I believe. And we were in, I think, Oklahoma City at a SoonerCon, and Eric was there, and he came up to Brad and said, you know, would you be interested in writing this, whatever. And unfortunately, Brad had had a stroke recently, so I decided I would do it. And I wrote the, okay, Brad, what's the name of that? You know what I wrote, the one you didn't.
The Red Cardinal.
The Red Cardinal, yeah, the Red Cardinal. And I didn't even think that I could write, but I knew that I'd read a lot. So I wrote the Red Cardinal. Sometimes my brain does not work, but and that was the first thing I ever wrote, I believe, and I wrote the sequel. I think I have an unfinished one that I need to do, but the Hunt for the Red Cardinal, I knew I'd get it. I am halfway through another, basically a Red Cardinal type book, and if I ever get the computer I can work on, I will finish it. But I just wanted to know that some people with no experience can do it, but it helps to read a lot. Thank you. Now, what am I going to hit?
Yeah, my name's Jack Carroll. I never had much direct contact with Eric. His influence on me was mostly at second hand. The most important part of that influence, of course, was writing 1632 in the first place, and then opening it up to fan writing and discovering that it had potential far beyond what anyone could have predicted. What got me writing in the first place was in 2006, my wife gave me 3 of the paperbacks for a Christmas present. I read them all in the next day and a half. And in the back of one of those paperbacks was the link to the Bain website and the tech forum. So, being a thoroughly experienced electronics engineer with a physics and chemistry background, I started commenting on the technical problems of some of the writing going on at the time. Well, Eric had turned over some of the responsibilities for managing the whole thing to the editorial board. There were 4 people on it at the time. I believe Rick was one of them. I don't remember who the other 3 were. And I guess they decided from my commenting over the previous few months that I could write. Well, of course I could write. I'm an electronics engineer, and I've been writing technical reports and test procedures and user manuals for 35 years at that point. Sure, I could write. I had no idea I could write fiction. I had no idea what was involved in writing fiction. Well, they told me. Yeah, so they got after me to try writing something. I wrote a little first draft of a teacher in Grantville who had retrained as an electrical engineer during the power plant rebuild project. Put it up, posted it. They told me what was wrong with it. I rewrote it. They told me, yeah, those things are fixed. Now here are the next set of problems with it. Okay, I rewrote it again. That happened 2 more times. On the fourth time, it was the interaction between the teacher and his wife, who was also a teacher, and his 4 students in the physics seminar he was teaching, because the Grantville schools weren't up to teaching college level physics yet. The story sold, so I was hooked. Mostly, Eric's influence on me from that point on was indirect through what was being published, through what I read of his own statements, from what came from the board, and particularly from the SNRC sessions at the first few cons I went to. Well, I had 2 10-second interactions with him in those SNRC sessions, and one of them was, do you think the Venetians could maybe solve some of the problems of radio and get into it themselves? And he said it would be amazing if it didn't. That was all I needed. It started to percolate in the back of my head, and when the con came up during the COVID nightmare, and we had a convention online, he and Walt buttonholed me directly and asked me if I had a novel in me. Now, that novel is now in the queue at Bain, waiting to be accepted or not. It's called 1635, Venice Calling. And yes, it's a very technical novel. The radio technology and the physics and the atmosphere propagation are right up front in your face, but what the novel is about is the experiences of the many, many people who have to come together to make this complicated project succeed. And several alpha readers have come back to me, and they like it, so I'm hoping it gets published.
As we are recording this, come on, Brad. As we are recording this, it is 6:46. There's another Brad. Brad. We have 2 Brads here. Both of whom have written. One of whom is going to stay and not. But it's 6:47 right now, and opening ceremonies are at 7. So we're allowed to stay, and we can continue this. But for anyone who wants to leave and go to the opening ceremonies, I just want to make sure you're aware. If anyone wants to say something before that starts, speak up.
I came into 1632 through reading, and to tell you how important a cover is the cover of the 1632 book caught my eye in a bookstore, and I picked it up and read it, and it was amazing. And I found I said I got to find other stuff that goes with this. So I found some of the stuff that had been written then. And I said, I wonder if there's any kind of online presence where I can ask them about things. You know, how do you do this? and I found on the Banks bar, I found it, and I started commenting on stuff that I knew a little bit about. And they said, well, you need to write something. You need to write something. And Eric would say, write something. Don't write it somewhere else. And so I wrote a nonfiction article about tuberculosis, which was very depressing. I finally figured out that would probably kill them all. But anyway, it told me that I could write something, so I managed to write two short stories, and then the last couple of years, it's been my priorities had to shift. So I've been kind of away a little bit, but anyway, I've got stories that I want to write, but they'll get there eventually. And then at FenCon 9 years ago here, that's when I met Eric, and he said, "You're going to go eat with us, aren't you?" I said, "I guess I am." And that was it was a Mexican food place that he found in Grapevine, which is not a very direct shot from here. So Bjorn and I were riding in the back seat with let's see, Joy and Walt, and that was kind of the primitive days of the phone GPS. We drove all the way around we tried to go onto the Dallas airport through the gate there anyway, and we finally got there, and we had a great time. And but anyway, one guy I met there, he's on the list, Larry Holler. He didn't write a whole lot, but he was on the gun. I met him and he kind of took me around and showed me where to go, and he was enthusiastic about 1632. He was with the original gun group, and he told me about their discussions and their arguments and all that stuff. And of course, Nick Lawrence, and a lot of us knew him. But personally, I don't know if anybody knew him personally, but he wrote some great stories, and he talk about characters. He could write a character that you would want to meet. So, but when I was learning how to write, I got all these how-to books, and I went with the authors. I said, well, I better reread 1632 and get that voice and that how Eric wrote it. And I went, okay, this is going to be my prime text for how to write from now on. So anyway, that's.
I have to run, but I really invite people to stop by the table. There are some notes from people from Superstars talking about what Eric meant to him, and we have a book here. You know, feel free to write anything in. But I just wanted to take a minute. I don't know how many people knew Marilyn Kosmatka, so I just wanted to. I worked with Marilyn's son in the steel mill, and he was a cultural anthropologist. You'd be amazed who winds up in the steel mill, and a writer. And he went on to go into gaming. But the thing about Eric was he had more stories. It was just, you know, a whole range of them. And so sometimes the thing about Marilyn was she was a nurse and had worked in a maximum security prison, which was kind of, so she was the voice. She was not particularly looking to write, but she had an authentic voice to add to his story. And so he worked with her all the way through to write that book. But that's what I mean, the door was so always open, and he had such an ear for hearing other people's lived experiences and then inviting them and supporting them all the way through. And Marilyn never, he was dying to have her work with him again, but she didn't. But it's an amazing book, and it's such, to me, a picture of Eric, you know, seeing potential, you know, in everyone, actually. Anyway.
I'm not sure if I need to use this or not.
You need to stand by the microphone to be in the frame.
Oh, you want me in the frame? Well, maybe we should
Well,
turn this
I can
off.
always
It's a murder if we don't want anybody.
This is the problem with being a professional singer. You learn how to project your voice. Actually, I think I'm probably the latest published one, because I only had my first story out in issue 100.
There's one more after you. There's one that was all new and since the new magazine.
Excellent. Good. That makes me feel a little better. Not much. That wasn't the first time I've been published. I actually published a number of RPGs and war games in the early 80s. I published a bunch of academic work in 2000, and published a bunch of other stuff that I'd have to shoot you if you read it. Well, I can't talk about it. It happens. I've been reading the 1632 series since it came out, and I always enjoyed it, but you know, when you're writing in anthropology or sociology or military or intelligence stuff, you just don't have much time for other types of writing. So when I finally stopped doing most of that work, I'm sort of going, it's time to relax. Let's try my hand at writing fiction, as opposed to government reports. You know, it's just a different genre of fiction. So if any of you have read my bio for this con, it says, I'm a recovering academic. It's true. And I've had to learn how to write in a completely different manner, in a completely different voice, and write stories. Wow, what a concept. It's been great fun. I never interacted with Eric personally. I really wish I had. The only interactions I had with him were over a couple of Zoom calls. But even in the last Zoom call where we were chatting for a couple of minutes, I said that I'd been working with a character that Robert Waters had created, and Robert had given me the character. And he goes, well, what are you going to do with it? And I said, well, I want to write more stories about radio. He goes, where's that? The Three Leagues. Where's that? Switzerland. Oh, well, yeah, go ahead and do it. It's like, okay, cool. I will do that. Why'd you call it radio? Because that's what it was called at the time? Oh. Nobody else is using it. Robert, you're not using it, are you? No. Good. Have it. So I now have one almost completed novel in there and another one that's at about 105,000 words. So.
Anyone else? Is David going to say anything? David talked really about what he did when he got, I think it was the last, okay, you're good.
During the pandemic, there was a virtual con, and I went to that, and one of the panels there was basically, why would we want you to write for us, please, right? And part of that please was like, we love our writers, this is nothing against the writers we have, but if you're not an older white guy, pretty please with sugar and cherries, strawberries, everything on top, please. We want new voices, please. And I was kind of like, I'd been writing some fiction and some things targeted toward YA, and I went, I don't have a reason not to try. So I decided there was this character in 1632 with like one paragraph, and no one really seemed to be using her, so I was like, well, I wrote Walt. There's this character, Irene Flannery, and there really only seems to be like 3 sentences, and she was Eric's character, but can I have her? And he checked with Eric, and he said, sure. And I wrote this story set around the Ring of Fire, and the flash of light, and I put it on the bar, and shortly after that I got this feedback from the other barflies, and it said, yeah, they're not gonna buy that because you can't write anything set at a flash of light story. Those are not something you can do. They're not something they're gonna buy. And I was like, okay, but I think you're wrong because they already bought it. And they asked me to make it longer. So, like, if anyone is listening to this and you're hearing a bunch of people saying, no, 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 and there's all these long excuses for why it's a no, don't listen to them unless their name is Bjorn. And if I need to be more specific, it's Bjorn Hassler. So, like, that's it. He's the only one that gets to say no.
Sure, there's two of us around this weekend.
There you go. And since Chuck brought it up, there's a second how I got into this, which is after Eric died, the Gazette stopped and Ring of Fire Press stopped. And there were all these people saying, it's gone, like the universe is just dead, maybe I guess they'll publish what they have contracts out for, and it's done, it's over. And I was like, go Gazette! We're not done! Go Gazette! And like, people will be like, chill, go Gazette! We're not done! Like, finally, when a plan started to form, right, I had talked to them about I was willing to work on like the business side and investing and being part of a new team for something going forward to keep this going forward. And so when that started happening, I was brought in, and it was just because I can be utterly relentless about some of the things when I really feel strongly about them, right? And I really feel strongly about this. And that's not saying I'll go forever, so if there's a point when you have to stop, there's a point when you have to stop. But we really care about this, right? And those of us, the three of us that are really leading the new magazine, are working very much with the family and with Bain. And one of the two most important things for us are first, making sure this is a fiscally sound business venture so it doesn't crater, okay? That's important. But the other thing is this has to be the kind of venture Eric would be proud of. If we were to say, you're not good enough, like, we're not gonna work with you, that's not what Eric would do. Eric would say, you're not good enough in this, you're not quite there in this moment, work on this, and help the person whose writing isn't good enough for professional publication to get to the point where their writing is good enough and then publish it. That's what our goal is. Our goal is to continue doing the things that Eric did that made this universe so very special. So that's sort of the two different, how I got here as a writer and how I got here as part of Eric Flint's 1632 and Beyond as the new magazine. So, and I believe Virginia's going to wrap it up, but I have one other thing really quick while Virginia can walk up. I brought swag. So we have these, make sure you find me. I would like to give away as much as I can tonight. There's a little journal, and there's also, officially it's a wine bottle tote, but I have my water bottle in it, and I have a soda bottle in it. It fits an umbrella nicely, actually. So I've got these. I've also got mini carabiners. I've got enough of these for everyone who's a 1632 fan, and I've got enough carabiners for everyone in attendance, I believe. So make sure you see me for swag. And I'll just, hopefully these are in focus so people at home can see what you didn't get.
Okay, I'm going to emphasize one other thing that was a constant theme of Eric's all the way through, which was, do not underestimate, if you are a professional writer, the importance of the art on the cover of your books. I walked into Barnes & Noble one day. I was a devoted patron of Barnes & Noble at the time. It was quite close to my house. And on the science fiction shelves, there was this lovely book that had this adorable red pickup truck on the front. Well, I have a younger brother who has been a farmer all his life, but as a hobby, he restores old machinery. He writes articles for Antique Power, as well as humor articles for various agricultural publications. And he had a restored red pickup truck, very much the same vintage, and I therefore pulled the book off the shelf and bought it, largely because the cover had attracted my attention. Repeating what someone else said, there was in the back of the book a link to Baines Bar and the 1632 Tech Forum on Baines Bar. And as it happened, my academic background was in this exact place and period, so I logged on to Baines Bar, came to 1632 Tech, and said, gee, I really like it that you picked this period. It's not one that's focused on very much in alternate history. As a matter of fact, I have some background in the field, and I would be happy to consult. Oh, good. We'll ask you every question. When I gave Beth Ann and Bjorn my archive of emails with Eric, I said, many of these emails probably won't make a lot of sense because Eric would phone me and say, could I do this? And I will frequently say, well, I'm going to have to look it up a little bit, so what you have is answers to, but you don't know what the question was. So we went on that way quite a bit. Much of my writing in the series was what you might call assignment writing. Eric would look at me and say, we need to do this. It started with the Grandma Richter story. You need to write something about this. I pointed out that my writing background was not in fiction, that I had done academic things like the diplomatic career of Georg III Kruxess von Waldburg as regent of the Austrians in Württemberg. Then, after I started picking up gig work, there were these thrilling titles like An Index of German Military Settlers in Canada After the American Revolution, followed by a long series of technical reports for the Department of the Interior on groups that think they would like to be Indian tribes even though they're not. So I said, really, Eric, wouldn't you just like information? You really don't need me to write stories. But Eric was quite persuaded that anyone could write stories if they put their mind to it. And mine you could follow in, I've written some that just occurred to me now and then, but part of them was his declaration, Lotharingia shall rise again. He wanted a buffer state between the Germanys and France. So Lorraine, the Grand Duchy of Burgundy, they were basically figure out some way for this to happen. The last bit of stuff I was writing, he looked at me and said, you know, when I developed the leaders of the 4th of July party to come to a meeting, I just grabbed these names out of the air and assigned them to provinces. Can you think of something that will give backstories to them? And if you read the thing that I did with Steve Sterling for the first issue of 1632 and beyond, there's a little bitty Easter egg in it in which the people talk about what they know of the background of the 4th of July party leader in Magdeburg province. In the back of what was happening in the unexpected sales reps is the 4th of July party leader there, in which I devoted quite a bit of time to figuring out why did Eric, for the Upper Palatinate, pick the name of someone who would have had to be of the lower nobility over in the Rhineland and Catholic. So I came up with some background for the man, hopefully that would explain it. And as I wrote back to Eric, I said, do you have any preferences on what kind of character he's going to be? No, says Eric, you go ahead and pick whatever you want. And I wrote back after I'd done it and said, well, basically, he's Walter Mondale. You know, you do all these shorthand things when you're filling something out. But really, it would not have occurred to me to spend the 20 years of my retirement writing fiction if it hadn't been for Eric. Okay, anyone else have anything to say?
Before we go to Eric?
And we're free to keep talking as long as we want, according to the hotel, because they don't have anything else scheduled in here.
And I'm going to say one last thing, which is Virginia is the one who set this all up for us. She did all of the organizing and work on doing this dinner, and she has done so much more than just writing some fiction. She is a key part of this universe being what it is. She did the grid. So that is key.
So you can free to keep talking as long as you want to keep talking.